Hi everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to guide you into a world of relaxation tonight. If this video helps you unwind and fall asleep, don't forget to like and subscribe, it means so much to me. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, find a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's begin. The office was quiet, the kind of stillness that made every sound seem magnified. The faint hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional creak of a chair, and the soft tapping of fingers on keyboards blended into a soothing background noise. It was a small corporate space, with cubicles lined up in perfect rows and motivational posters plastered on pale gray walls. The kind of place where time seemed to stretch and days blurred together. But recently, something had changed. It began when the manager, Mr. Grayson, decided to add a touch of character to the otherwise sterile space. The employees arrived one Monday morning to find a large, ornate portrait hanging in the corner of the office's common room. It was an oil painting, old and weathered, its colors muted by time. The frame was gilded, heavy with intricate floral designs, but the real focus was the figure within. The man in the portrait was dressed in 19th century attire. A sharp black coat, a stiff white cravat, and a gold pocket watch peeking from his vest. His expression was severe, his dark eyes almost too sharp, as though they could pierce through the canvas and into the soul of anyone who dared to look at him too long. "Where did this come from?" someone asked that morning, their voice tinged with unease. Mr. Grayson had waved off the question with a dismissive smile. "Found it at an estate sale. Thought it would add some personality to the place." But personality wasn't the word most of the employees would have chosen. There was something unsettling about the portrait. It seemed out of place, too grand and too imposing for the drab little office. And then there were the eyes. No matter where you stood in the room, it felt as though the man in the painting was watching you. His gaze followed you, unblinking and unyielding, as if he were waiting for something or someone. At first, the employees tried to ignore it. After all, it was just a painting. But as the days went on, a strange unease began to settle over the office. It started small. Jane, the receptionist, swore she heard footsteps behind her one evening as she was locking up. But when she turned around, no one was there. Steve from accounting mentioned feeling a cold draft near the painting, even though the windows were sealed and the air conditioning was off. Then there were the noises. Faint whispers, just barely audible, seemed to emanate from the common room late at night. The cleaning crew refused to work in there after 10 p.m., claiming they heard voices when no one else was around. "Probably just the old building settling," Mr. Grayson said with a shrug when complaints started rolling in. But Alex, one of the newer employees, wasn't so sure. He'd always been a skeptic, quick to dismiss anything that couldn't be logically explained. Ghosts, curses, haunted objects, they were all just stories to him. Yet something about the painting unnerved him in a way he couldn't quite explain. One evening, as he stayed late to finish a report, Alex found himself alone in the office. The soft glow of his desk lamp barely reached the common room, but he could see the outline of the portrait in the shadows. It loomed in the corner, its gilded frame catching just enough light to glint faintly. Alex's eyes were drawn to the painting against his better judgment. The man's gaze seemed sharper in the dim light, his expression colder. For a fleeting moment, Alex thought he saw the slightest twitch of the man's lips, as if he were about to speak. He shook his head, laughing nervously at himself. "Get a grip," he muttered, turning back to his work, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. The next morning, Alex mentioned his experience to Jane as they waited for the coffee machine to sputter to life. "I know what you mean," she said, her voice low. "I swear, sometimes I feel like it's listening." "Listening?" Alex raised an eyebrow. "It's just a painting." "I know," Jane said quickly, glancing nervously toward the common room, "but it doesn't feel like one." They weren't the only ones who felt it. Over the following weeks, more employees began to share similar stories in hushed tones. Pens disappearing from desks only to reappear hours later, chairs moving slightly out of place, the faint sensation of being watched even when the common room was empty. The painting became a topic of whispered speculation, a source of growing tension in the office. Yet no one dared to confront Mr. Grayson about it. He seemed oddly protective of the portrait, brushing off any concerns with a cheerful, "It's just your imagination." But Alex couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. And as the days stretched into weeks, the painting seemed to change. The man's eyes grew darker, his expression harder, and Alex could have sworn the shadows in the common room seemed deeper, as though the portrait were slowly consuming the light around it. He started staying late on purpose, determined to prove to himself that it was all in his head. But the more time he spent alone with the painting, the more convinced he became that something was very, very wrong. One night, as he stood in front of the portrait, staring into its haunting gaze, Alex whispered, "What do you want?" For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, ever so faintly, the corners of the painted man's mouth curled into a chilling smile. This opening establishes the unsettling atmosphere of the office, introduces the painting, and sets the stage for the supernatural events to come. Let me know if you'd like to continue with part 2. Alex tried to tell himself he had imagined it. Paintings couldn't smile or move, for that matter. It was just a trick of the light, a product of his overworked mind. But no amount of rationalization could erase the image from his thoughts. The faint curl of the painted man's lips lingered in Alex's memory like a shadow he couldn't shake. The unease in the office grew steadily over the next few days. It wasn't just Alex who noticed the changes. Others began to whisper about the portrait as well, their voices low and wary. "Did you see it?" Jane asked one morning as Alex poured himself a cup of coffee. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her mug. "See what?" "The painting," she said, glancing nervously toward the common room. "Yesterday, I swear it was tilted to the left. But this morning, it's perfectly straight again. I mean, who fixed it? And why didn't they say anything?" Alex frowned. He hadn't noticed the frame being tilted, but Jane's fear was palpable. "Maybe the cleaning crew adjusted it," he offered, though the explanation felt hollow even as he said it. Jane shook her head. "The cleaning crew hasn't been here in days. They're refusing to work late because of the noises." Alex didn't reply. He couldn't deny that something was off. It wasn't just the frame. The changes started small, almost imperceptible. The man's expression in the portrait seemed to shift ever so slightly each day. At first, it was subtle, a raised brow here, a faint narrowing of the eyes there. But as the days passed, the differences became more pronounced. One morning, Alex walked into the office and froze in the doorway of the common room. The man in the painting looked different. His lips, which had been pressed into a tight line, were now curved in the faintest hint of a smirk. "Did that always look like that?" Alex asked aloud, his voice wavering. Steve, who had just walked in behind him, gave the painting a cursory glance. "What are you talking about?" "The expression," Alex said, pointing. "He wasn't smiling yesterday." Steve squinted at the painting, then shrugged. "Looks the same to me." "You're overthinking it, man." But Alex knew he wasn't. He couldn't stop staring at the painting throughout the day. The smirk was faint but unmistakable, as though the man in the portrait was amused by something only he knew. By the end of the week, more people began to notice the changes. The whispers around the office grew louder, employees nervously speculating about the painting. "His hand wasn't like that before, was it?" someone asked one afternoon, pointing at the gilded frame. Alex leaned in to look. The man's left hand, which had previously rested on his lap, now appeared to be gripping the edge of his chair. The change was subtle but unnerving, as though the painted figure had shifted his position overnight. "Maybe it's just the angle," Steve suggested again, though his voice lacked conviction. "Or maybe it's haunted," Jane muttered, her voice barely audible. The painting didn't just change in appearance, it began to move. One evening, Alex stayed late to finish a report. The office was dark and silent, the only light coming from his desk lamp. He tried to focus on his work, but his eyes kept drifting toward the common room. The painting was still there, its faintly smirking subject staring out into the empty space. Alex shook his head and turned back to his computer. But when he glanced up again, his breath caught in his throat. The painting had shifted. It wasn't in its usual spot on the far wall. Now, it was hanging closer to the door, its gilded frame gleaming faintly in the dim light. Alex stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked slowly toward the common room, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the painting, it was back in its original position. He stared at it, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? Was it just his exhaustion playing tricks on him? But then he noticed something else. The man in the portrait was no longer sitting. He was standing, one hand gripping the back of his chair, his dark eyes locked directly on Alex. Alex stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. He didn't stop running until he was safely in his car, the office building looming dark and silent behind him. The next morning, Alex arrived early, determined to confront Mr. Grayson about the painting. But when he walked into the common room, his stomach dropped. The painting was gone. In its place was a blank section of wall, the faint outline of the frame still visible against the paint. "Where is it?" Alex demanded when Mr. Grayson arrived. "Where's what?" Mr. Grayson asked, confused. "The painting," Alex said. "The portrait you hung in the common room. Where did it go?" Mr. Grayson frowned. "Alex, what are you talking about? There's never been a painting in there." Alex stared at him, stunned. "But we've all seen it. Everyone's been talking about it." Mr. Grayson shook his head. "I think you've been working too hard. Take the day off, Alex." But Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As he left the office, his eyes caught a flash of gold in one of the conference rooms. He froze, peering through the glass door. The painting was there. The man in the portrait was standing now, his expression cold and severe, his eyes watching Alex with an intensity that made his skin crawl. And this time, Alex was sure of it. The painted man was closer. This part explores the unsettling shifts in the painting's position and expression, building tension as the changes grow increasingly obvious and personal. Let me know if you'd like to move on to part 3. Alex couldn't ignore the painting anymore. No matter how much he tried to convince himself it was just a trick of his imagination, the changes were too real, too deliberate. The man in the portrait wasn't just shifting his expression or position, he was moving with intent. Alex could feel it, and so could the others, even if they refused to admit it outright. Something had to be done. The next evening, Alex stayed late at the office, waiting for everyone to leave. His plan was simple. He would take the painting down and lock it away in the storage room at the far end of the building. He didn't know if it would work, but he needed to try. As the last coworker waved goodbye, Alex watched the clock tick past 9 p.m. The office was silent now, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. He walked to the common room, a box cutter in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The painting loomed in its usual spot, its gilded frame gleaming faintly in the dim light. The man in the portrait seemed more imposing tonight, his dark eyes sharper, his stance more rigid. Alex hesitated, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. "You're just a painting," he muttered under his breath, trying to steady his nerves. The words felt hollow in the empty room. He reached up and unhooked the painting from the wall. It was heavier than he expected, the frame cold to the touch. For a moment, Alex thought he felt a faint vibration beneath his fingertips, as though the painting itself was resisting him. He shook the thought away and carried it down the hall to the storage room. The room was small and cluttered, filled with old office chairs, dusty file cabinets, and unused supplies. Alex propped the painting against the farthest wall, leaning it carefully against a stack of boxes. "There," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the confined space. He closed the door and locked it, the sound of the bolt sliding into place giving him a brief sense of relief. But as he turned to leave, he felt a chill run down his spine. The hallway was empty, but the air felt different, heavier, colder. Alex quickened his pace, his footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. He grabbed his coat from his desk and headed for the door, eager to put as much distance as possible between himself and the office. The next morning, Alex arrived early, determined to see if the painting was still in the storage room. As he walked through the hallway, his heart sank. The painting was back. It hung in its usual spot in the common room, the man in the portrait staring down at him with an expression that seemed triumphant. His lips were curved in a faint smirk, and his hand, which had previously rested on the back of the chair, now pointed directly at Alex. "No," Alex whispered, his chest tightening. He stormed down the hall to the storage room, fumbling with the key. When he opened the door, the painting was gone. The boxes it had leaned against were undisturbed, as though it had never been there at all. Alex stumbled back into the hallway, his mind racing. "Who brought it back?" he muttered under his breath. Someone had to move it. But deep down, he knew the truth. That night, Alex decided to try again. This time, he wouldn't just move the painting, he would take it out of the building entirely. He waited until the office was empty, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights the only sound. The painting seemed heavier than before, its gilded frame cold and unyielding beneath his fingers. As he carried it out to his car, he could feel the man in the portrait watching him. Even though he avoided looking directly at it, the weight of the painted man's gaze seemed to press down on him, making it harder to breathe. Alex shoved the painting into his trunk and slammed the lid shut. For a moment, he stood there in the cold night air, his hands trembling. "It's just a painting," he muttered. "Just a stupid painting." He drove to a nearby storage facility, where he had rented a small unit. The facility was deserted at this hour, the rows of metal doors stretching into the darkness. Alex parked his car and dragged the painting out of the trunk. He propped it up against the back wall of the storage unit and locked the door behind him. "This is where you stay," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the cold, empty space. When Alex arrived at the office the next morning, his stomach dropped. The painting was back. It hung in its usual spot, as though it had never been moved. The man in the portrait seemed closer now, his dark eyes boring into Alex with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The smirk on his face was unmistakable this time, and his hand, which had pointed at Alex the day before, now rested on the edge of the frame, as though he were preparing to step out. Alex backed away slowly, his mind racing. "No," he whispered. "No, this isn't happening." But it was. No matter where Alex took the painting, no matter how far he tried to move it, it always returned. Each time, it seemed to grow more lifelike, its changes more dramatic. The man in the portrait wasn't just watching anymore. He was waiting. This part builds the tension as Alex's attempts to remove the painting fail, and the mysterious power of the portrait becomes undeniable. Let me know if you'd like to continue with part 4, the climax. The painting's return left Alex shaken, but it was the changes in the man's expression that truly unhinged him. What had once been a faint smirk was now a full grin, cold and predatory. His posture had shifted even further. He was no longer seated or standing passively. The painted man leaned forward slightly, one hand gripping the gilded frame as though he were preparing to step through. Alex's co-workers whispered about it constantly now, their uneasy glances darting toward the painting whenever they passed the common room. Jane refused to enter the room entirely. Even Mr. Grayson, who had once dismissed the strange occurrences, avoided looking directly at the portrait. But Alex couldn't avoid it. He felt its presence everywhere, an oppressive weight that seemed to follow him even when he wasn't in the room. Worse, there were noises. It started with faint creaks, like the sound of old wood settling, though it always seemed to come from behind the painting. The first time Alex heard it, he dismissed it as nothing unusual. After all, the office building was old, and strange noises were to be expected. But the creaks grew louder. Late one evening, as Alex sat at his desk trying to finish a report, the noise became impossible to ignore. A low, rhythmic thudding echoed through the office, coming from the direction of the common room. He froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound wasn't random, it was deliberate. Like the steady beat of footsteps, Alex swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced around the empty office, half expecting to see someone else. But he was alone. The thudding stopped, replaced by a new sound. A faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from behind the painting. Against his better judgment, Alex walked toward the common room. The scratching grew louder with each step, a relentless, grating sound that set his teeth on edge. The painting loomed in the dim light, its gilded frame gleaming faintly. The man in the portrait seemed different again, his grin wider, his eyes darker. Alex's breath hitched as he noticed something new. The painted man's hand now reached beyond the edge of the frame, his fingers curling around the bottom as though gripping it from within. The scratching stopped. Alex stood frozen, his heart pounding. The silence was suffocating, but he couldn't bring himself to move. And then he heard a faint, rasping breath coming from behind the painting. "No," Alex whispered, his voice trembling. "This isn't real." But the sound came again, louder this time, unmistakably human. It was as though someone or something was trapped behind the canvas. Alex grabbed the nearest object he could find, a heavy metal ruler from a nearby desk, and approached the painting. His hands shook as he reached out, the cold metal frame biting into his palms. "I'm done with this," he muttered, his voice wavering. With a single, desperate motion, he yanked the painting off the wall. The room fell silent. Alex stared at the blank wall behind the frame, his chest heaving. There was nothing there, no hidden door, no crawl space, nothing that could explain the sounds. He let out a shaky breath, his grip on the painting loosening. But as he turned the painting over to place it on the ground, his blood ran cold. The canvas was pulsing. It was faint, but undeniable. The surface of the painting moved as though something inside it was struggling to get out. Alex dropped the painting with a loud thud and stumbled backward. He tripped over a chair and fell to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The pulsing grew stronger, the canvas stretching outward as though an invisible force were pressing against it from the other side. And then it spoke. "Let me out." The voice was low and guttural, resonating from deep within the painting. Alex scrambled to his feet, his back pressed against the far wall. "Stay away," he shouted, his voice cracking. The canvas bulged violently, the painted man's face distorting as though something were trying to push through it. The ornate frame began to creak, the sound sharp and jarring in the silent room. Alex grabbed a chair and swung it at the painting, the wood splintering as it collided with the frame. But the painting didn't break. Instead, the voice grew louder. "You can't stop this," it growled. "You brought me here. I didn't do anything." Alex shouted, his vision blurred with tears. The room seemed to darken, the shadows growing deeper, more oppressive. The air was thick, suffocating, and Alex could feel his chest tightening as though the weight of the painting's presence was pressing down on him. The canvas stretched one final time, splitting down the center with a sickening tear. A hand, pale, twisted, and unervingly real, reached through the opening. Alex screamed. He didn't remember how he got out of the office. The next thing he knew, he was standing in the parking lot, his hands trembling and his heart racing. The building loomed behind him, dark and silent, but he could still hear the voice, faint and mocking, echoing in his mind. "You can't run, Alex. You can't escape me." This climax builds intense suspense, incorporating vivid imagery and escalating supernatural events as the painting comes alive. Let me know if you'd like to move on to part 5. The resolution? Alex didn't return to the office the next day or the day after that. He didn't call in, didn't answer his phone, and didn't check his email. Instead, he stayed in his apartment, blinds drawn, pacing the small space as if movement alone could shake off the oppressive memories of the previous night. But it didn't work. The image of the torn canvas, the pale, unnatural hand reaching through, haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the painted man's grin, growing wider, sharper, more alive. The voice still echoed in his mind, low and guttural, whispering threats and promises he didn't want to hear. "You can't escape me, Alex." By the third day, the whispers began to feel louder, as though they weren't just in his mind anymore. The faint sound of scratching started at the edges of his hearing, coming from the walls, the windows, the corners of his apartment. Alex tried to tell himself it wasn't real, but deep down, he knew the truth. The painting wasn't just in the office. It was with him. That night, Alex made a decision. He couldn't keep running. If the painting, or whatever was inside it, wasn't going to leave him alone, he had to confront it. He didn't know what that meant or how he could possibly fight something so far beyond his understanding, but he couldn't live like this anymore. He drove back to the office after midnight, the streets eerily quiet under the pale glow of the streetlights. The building loomed ahead, dark and empty, its windows reflecting nothing but shadows. Alex parked his car and sat there for a long moment, staring at the entrance. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He thought about driving away, leaving the office and the painting behind for good. But where would he go? The whispers had followed him home. It wouldn't stop until he faced it. Taking a deep breath, Alex stepped out of the car and made his way to the door. The office was colder than he remembered, the fluorescent lights flickering weakly overhead. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the building itself was holding its breath. The common room was exactly as he had left it. The painting hung in its usual spot, pristine and undamaged, the torn canvas now whole again. The man in the portrait stood tall, his expression triumphant, his hands still reaching out as if inviting Alex to step closer. Alex approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the silent room. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of how real this was. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The painted man's grin widened. "You," the voice said, low and resonant, as though it were coming from all around him. The room darkened, the shadows deepening until Alex could barely see the painting in front of him. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of scratching filled the room, coming from everywhere at once. Alex clenched his fists, his fear giving way to anger. "You don't control me," he said, his voice rising. "You're just a painting. You're nothing." The laughter that followed was cold and hollow, reverberating through the room. "You brought me here," the voice said, its tone almost amused. "You kept looking. You couldn't let me go." Alex's mind raced. The voice was right. He had been the one to linger, to question, to try to fight it. Every attempt to remove the painting, every night spent obsessing over it, had only given it more power. But maybe he could take that power back. With trembling hands, Alex grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it at the painting. The frame cracked under the impact, the canvas splitting once more. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe in response, the scratching growing louder, more frantic. "You can't destroy me," the voice growled. But there was a note of uncertainty now. Alex didn't stop. He grabbed a metal paperweight from a nearby desk and slammed it against the frame, again and again, until the gilded edges splintered and the canvas hung in tatters. The room shuddered, the walls groaning as though the building itself were protesting his actions. The shadows seemed to surge toward him, but Alex stood his ground, his breathing ragged. With one final blow, he shattered the frame completely, the remnants of the painting falling to the floor in a heap of torn canvas and broken wood. The room fell silent. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, the shadows retreating to their corners. Alex stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The painting was gone. In the days that followed, Alex felt lighter than he had in weeks. The whispers stopped, and the oppressive presence that had haunted him was nowhere to be found. He returned to work, his co-workers surprised but relieved to see him. The common room was different now. The wall where the painting had hung freshly painted and bare. No one mentioned the portrait, and Alex didn't bring it up. It was as though the office had collectively decided to forget it ever existed. But Alex couldn't forget. Every now and then, he thought he heard faint scratching in the distance, or felt a pair of unseen eyes watching him. He told himself it was just his imagination, a lingering side effect of the nightmare he had endured. Still, he avoided the common room whenever he could, and every time he passed by, he couldn't help but glance at the bare wall, half expecting to see the painting staring back at him, the man's cold, triumphant grin frozen in time. Alex worked the graveyard shift, the kind of schedule that made you forget the rhythm of the world. His nights were long and quiet, with only the stretch of an empty road accompanying him on his drive home. It was the same every night, an unlit, desolate street with no cars and no sign of life. The only anomaly was an old, rusted phone booth sitting at the edge of the road, forgotten and out of place in a world that had moved past such relics. For months, Alex passed the booth without a second thought. It was just another piece of roadside junk, its glass panes cracked, the light inside flickering weakly. But then, one night, something changed. It was 3 a.m., and Alex was driving home as usual. The road was its usual hauntingly silent self when a sound sliced through the stillness, a piercing, shrill ring. Alex's hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel. It was coming from the phone booth. He slowed his car, his headlights illuminating the decrepit structure. The phone was ringing, its sharp tone echoing eerily in the dead of night. Alex pulled over, leaving the engine running, and stepped out of his car. The cold air bit at his skin as he approached the booth. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if some unseen force was urging him to stop. When he reached the booth, the ringing abruptly stopped. Alex stared at the phone through the grimy glass. It dangled from its cord, swaying slightly as though someone had just released it. He hesitated, then opened the door with a creak. The smell of mildew and rust hit him, making him gag slightly. "Hello?" he said, lifting the receiver to his ear. His voice sounded hollow, almost foreign, in the booth's cramped space. There was no response, just static. Alex hung up, his heart pounding harder than he cared to admit. He stepped back to his car, casting one last glance at the booth. It sat there, silent and unassuming, as though mocking him for his curiosity. The drive home felt longer that night, the silence in his car deafening. When he finally reached his apartment, Alex locked his door and checked the time. It was 3:17 a.m. He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over him. It wasn't just the phone ringing, there was something else. A presence. A whisper of wrongness that clung to him like a shadow. The next night, he told himself to ignore it. It was just an old phone with faulty wiring, nothing more. But when 3 a.m. came again, so did the ringing. And Alex couldn't ignore it this time. Alex worked the night shift at a small security firm, the kind of job where you counted the hours, not the accomplishments. His shift ended at 2:30 a.m., and the drive home took him down a lonely stretch of road that most would avoid at night. No streetlights, no houses with porch lights left on, just an endless expanse of cracked asphalt lined by skeletal trees and overgrown grass. The isolation suited him, or so he told himself. After all, there was something oddly calming about being the only soul awake in a sleeping town. But amidst the emptiness, one thing stood out: an old phone booth. It was the kind of relic you might see in a movie, abandoned and irrelevant in an age of smartphones. The booth sat crooked at the edge of the road, its glass smeared with dirt and graffiti. One of the panes had been shattered long ago, leaving jagged shards clinging to the frame. Its light flickered faintly, as though it were holding on to life just as stubbornly as the booth itself. For months, Alex passed the booth without giving it a second glance. It was a relic, nothing more, a forgotten artifact of a bygone era. But that changed on a cold December night. The clock on Alex's dashboard read 3 a.m. as he turned onto the familiar stretch of road. His heater hummed softly, struggling to keep the winter chill at bay. He yawned, his eyes heavy from a long shift of uneventful monotony. That's when he heard it. A sound pierced the silence, a sharp, insistent ringing that sliced through the stillness like a knife. Alex's foot hovered over the brake pedal as he scanned the road. The noise was unmistakable, the shrill, metallic trill of a phone. His headlights swept across the phone booth, illuminating its weathered frame. The ringing was coming from inside. Alex's pulse quickened. He slowed the car to a crawl, his mind racing. Who would be calling a phone booth at this hour? Does it even work anymore? The thought was absurd, yet the sound was undeniable. He pulled to the side of the road, the tires crunching on loose gravel. His car idled, the engine's low rumble doing little to soothe his unease. For a moment, Alex considered driving away. There was no one around, no reason to answer. But something, a mix of curiosity and an irrational sense of obligation, compelled him to step out. The night air was biting, seeping through his jacket as he approached the booth. Each step felt heavier, as though the shadows around him were pressing closer. The ringing continued, relentless and urgent, echoing off the trees. When Alex reached the booth, he hesitated. The door hung slightly ajar, its hinges rusted and stiff. He peered inside. The receiver dangled from its cord, swaying gently as though someone had just been there. The light overhead flickered erratically, casting long, jittery shadows. With a deep breath, Alex pushed the door open. It groaned in protest, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet. The smell hit him immediately, a mix of mildew, rust, and something faintly metallic, like blood. He picked up the receiver. "Hello?" His voice felt small, swallowed by the booth's confined space. At first, there was nothing, just a faint hiss of static. Then, a sound emerged, faint and distorted, like a voice submerged in water. "Hello?" Alex repeated, louder this time. The static crackled, and for a brief moment, he thought he heard something, a whisper, faint and indistinct. "Alex." He froze. The whisper had been soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and it had said his name. A shiver ran down his spine. He hung up abruptly, the receiver clattering against the booth's metal frame. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stepped back, his eyes locked on the phone. The booth was silent now, the only sound the distant rustle of wind through the trees. Alex hurried back to his car, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his heart pounding in his chest. For a long moment, he sat there, staring at the booth through his windshield. It stood motionless, as though mocking his fear. He forced himself to drive, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The road seemed darker than usual, the shadows denser. When he reached his apartment, Alex checked the time. 3:17 a.m. He locked his door and leaned against it, his mind replaying the events over and over. Had he imagined it? The voice, the whisper of his name, surely. It was a trick of his tired mind. But deep down, Alex knew better. There had been a presence in that booth, something unseen yet undeniably there. The next night, Alex convinced himself it was nothing. A faulty phone, maybe, or a random coincidence. But as the clock approached 3 a.m., unease began to creep in. His stomach knotted as he turned onto the familiar road, his headlights sweeping across the landscape. And then it happened again. The phone rang. This time, Alex didn't stop. He drove past the booth, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But as he sped away, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. When he got home, he didn't sleep. The ringing echoed in his mind, louder and more insistent than it had been in reality. And for the first time in years, Alex felt truly alone, not the kind of solitude he had grown accustomed to, but something far darker. Something was waiting for him in that booth, and he had a terrible feeling it wouldn't stop calling. This expanded section is detailed with Alex's emotions, the eerie atmosphere of the road, and the build-up to the first encounter. Let me know if you'd like me to continue to part 2. The night after Alex first heard the phone ringing, he promised himself he wouldn't stop again. Whatever curiosity had led him to approach the booth felt foolish now, overshadowed by the gnawing unease that clung to him like a second skin. Still, as the clock neared 3 a.m. and the road stretched out before him in its haunting emptiness, Alex couldn't ignore the knot tightening in his chest. When the ringing started, his resolve cracked. This time, it was louder, sharper, as if the sound itself were clawing at his mind. He gritted his teeth, forcing his eyes to stay on the road, but his foot instinctively eased off the gas. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, the faint hum of his car's heater drowned out by the relentless shrill. "Don't stop," Alex muttered to himself, his voice shaky. "Just drive." But his body betrayed him. His car slowed, then rolled to a stop just feet from the booth. It stood there, illuminated in his headlights, its battered frame casting jagged shadows on the road. The phone continued to ring, the sound slicing through the stillness like a scream. Alex sat frozen, his heart pounding in his ears. He could drive away, leave it behind and never look back. But something was pulling him, a magnetic force he couldn't explain. Before he knew it, he was standing outside the booth. The air was colder tonight, biting at his skin despite his heavy jacket. The faint glow of the booth's flickering light seemed dimmer, casting an eerie pallor over the glass smeared with grime. The phone dangled from its cord again, swaying slightly in a wind Alex couldn't feel. He hesitated, his hand hovering near the receiver. The ringing stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Alex swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. But the road was empty. Then, almost as if in defiance of the stillness, the phone let out a single, piercing ring. Alex jumped, his pulse spiking. Before he could think, his hand shot out, grabbing the receiver. "Hello?" he said, his voice trembling. For a moment, there was nothing but static, faint and uneven, like a radio tuned to a dead station. Alex strained to listen, his breath shallow. Then, a whisper. "Alex." The voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. It spoke his name with a familiarity that sent shivers racing down his spine. "Who is this?" Alex demanded, his voice cracking. The static shifted, growing louder, and the whisper came again, closer this time. "Alex, do you remember?" He froze. The voice, it wasn't just familiar. It was impossible. "Mom," he whispered, his throat tightening. The line went dead. Alex's mind reeled. His mother had been dead for over a decade. He had buried her, stood at her grave, and said goodbye. But that voice, it was hers. He was sure of it. The receiver slipped from his hand, clattering against the metal frame. Alex stumbled out of the booth, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The world around him felt wrong, the shadows darker, the air heavier. He climbed into his car and locked the doors, his shaking hands fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and Alex sped away, his headlights slicing through the oppressive darkness. At home, he sat on his couch, staring blankly at the wall. His mind raced, replaying the voice over and over. It couldn't have been her. It wasn't possible. But the way she had said his name, the tone, the inflection, it was etched into his memory. He grabbed his phone and searched for information about the booth. There was nothing, no history, no record of it even being operational. It was as though the booth didn't exist. The next night, Alex swore he wouldn't stop again. But deep down, he knew he would. Because if it really had been her, he needed to know why she was calling. This section delves into Alex's emotions, the eerie experience of hearing a familiar but impossible voice, and the psychological tension that begins to unravel him. Let me know if you'd like to continue with part 3. Alex didn't sleep that night. The voice, the way it had whispered his name, played on an endless loop in his mind. He sat on his couch until the sun came up, staring blankly at the wall. His rational side insisted it was a trick, an old recording, maybe a sick prank, but a deeper, more primal part of him knew better. The next night, he left for work with a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. The thought of driving past the booth again made his skin crawl, but he couldn't avoid it. The road was the fastest way home, and after a grueling shift, he just wanted to collapse in bed. As the clock neared 3 a.m., Alex felt the familiar weight of unease settle over him. The road stretched out in the darkness, the skeletal trees lining it like silent sentinels. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, and his jaw clenched as he approached the familiar bend. The phone was ringing. Alex slowed, the sound growing louder as his car crept closer. He told himself to keep driving, but his foot betrayed him, pressing the brake. The booth loomed in his headlights, its faint light flickering weakly, casting shadows that seemed to pulse in time with the ringing. "Don't stop," Alex muttered under his breath. "Don't." But his car was already at a standstill. The ringing seemed to pierce straight into his skull, insistent and impossible to ignore. His hands trembled as he opened the car door and stepped into the cold night air. The wind was sharp, but it carried no sound other than the phone. Alex approached the booth, his breath visible in the frigid air. The receiver hung crookedly, the cord twisted like a noose. He hesitated for a moment, his instinct screaming at him to turn around. But the pull was stronger. He picked up the receiver. "Hello?" His voice was steadier this time, though his heart raced. Static greeted him, crackling softly before fading into a suffocating silence. "Alex." The whisper returned, clearer now. His grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" he demanded. The static grew louder, a low hum that seemed to vibrate in his chest. Then, the voice spoke again, and Alex's blood ran cold. "Do you remember that summer at the lake?" Alex froze. He did remember. The summer when he was 16. The lake where he and his friends had spent their days swimming, laughing, and making reckless decisions. But there was one day he tried not to think about, one moment buried deep in the recesses of his memory. "How do you know about that?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The line crackled, and the voice answered with eerie calmness. "You didn't mean for it to happen, did you?" Alex's breath hitched. His grip on the receiver faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, though his voice betrayed him. "You left him there." The words hit him like a blow. Alex slammed the receiver down, stumbling out of the booth. His legs felt weak, and his vision blurred as he rushed back to his car. The memories he had worked so hard to suppress flooded his mind. The argument, the push, the way Mark's body had hit the water and disappeared beneath the surface. "No one saw," Alex muttered to himself as he gripped the steering wheel. "It was an accident." But the phone booth knew. The next night, Alex told himself he wouldn't stop. He had nothing to prove, nothing to gain by answering again. Yet when the clock struck 3 a.m. and the ringing filled the air, he found himself pulling over once more. This time, the voice was waiting for him. "Hello, Alex," it said before he could speak. He froze, the receiver cold against his ear. "I know you're scared," the voice continued. "You've spent years running from it, pretending it never happened. But you can't hide forever. Who are you?" Alex snapped, his anger overcoming his fear. The voice chuckled softly, the sound warped and hollow. "I'm just someone who knows the truth." The static surged, and Alex thought he heard something else beneath it, a faint sound, like water lapping against a shore. His stomach churned. "You have to stop calling me," he said, his voice shaking. The voice ignored him. Do you ever wonder what he felt, sinking into the dark? How cold it was. Alex's knees buckled, and he leaned against the side of the booth for support. "Shut up," he hissed. "He trusted you," the voice whispered, almost tenderly, "and you left him there, alone." The line went dead, but Alex stayed frozen. The receiver pressed to his ear as the silence wrapped around him. When he finally made it home, Alex didn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring out into the night, waiting for the phone to ring again. And it did. Not from the booth this time, but from his own phone, sitting on the table across the room. It was 3 a.m. This section builds the tension as the calls grow increasingly personal, haunting Alex with specific details of his past. The slow unraveling of his psyche is emphasized through his interactions with the mysterious voice and his inability to escape the truth. Let me know if you'd like to proceed to the next part. Alex couldn't take it anymore. The calls, the voice, the suffocating feeling that his past was clawing its way back to him, it was too much. For days, he'd been trapped in a cycle of dread, unable to eat, sleep, or think about anything other than the phone booth. The voice knew too much. It wasn't just dredging up memories, it was feeding on them, twisting them, using them to break him apart. On the fifth night, as the clock ticked toward 3 a.m., Alex made a decision. He wouldn't answer again. Not ever. If the booth wouldn't stop calling, he would destroy it. The road stretched out before him, the same as always. But tonight, Alex wasn't afraid. His trunk was packed with tools, a sledgehammer, a can of gasoline, and a crowbar. He was going to end this nightmare. When the ringing started, Alex didn't hesitate. He slammed on the brakes, his car skidding to a stop in the gravel. The sound was louder than ever, piercing and relentless, like an alarm meant to wake the dead. He stepped out of the car, gripping the sledgehammer tightly in his hands. The night air was icy, biting at his skin, but Alex barely noticed. His focus was on the booth, its flickering light casting eerie shadows across the road. The ringing stopped as he approached. The sudden silence was almost worse than the sound. Alex stood in front of the booth, breathing heavily. It looked the same as always, rusted, grimy, and impossibly ordinary. But he knew better. "You think you can control me?" he muttered under his breath. "You think you can scare me?" Without waiting for an answer, he swung the sledgehammer. The blow landed with a deafening crash, shattering the glass into a rain of jagged shards. Alex swung again and again, the metal frame denting under the force. Each strike felt like a release, the weight of his fear giving way to raw anger. When the booth was little more than a crumpled, shattered ruin, Alex stepped back, panting. His hands were trembling, his arms aching from the effort, but he felt a spark of triumph. "It's over," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty night. He turned back to his car, ready to leave the wreckage behind. But as he reached for the door, a sound stopped him cold. The ringing. Alex spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. The booth was whole. The glass was intact, the metal frame unblemished, and the light inside flickered weakly, just as it always had. The receiver dangled from its cord, swaying gently in a wind that didn't exist. "No," Alex whispered, stumbling backward. "No, that's not possible." The ringing grew louder, more insistent, almost mocking. Alex's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to move. He grabbed the gasoline can from his trunk and marched back to the booth. "This ends now," he said through gritted teeth. He doused the booth in gasoline, the pungent smell burning his nostrils. The liquid dripped down the glass and pooled at the base, soaking into the ground. Alex struck a match and watched the flame dance for a moment before tossing it onto the booth. The fire roared to life instantly, engulfing the structure in a wall of orange and red. The heat was intense, forcing Alex to step back as the flames consumed the booth. For a moment, he felt relief. But then the flames began to die. It wasn't gradual one moment, the fire was raging, and the next it was gone, snuffed out as though it had never existed. The booth stood unharmed, its light flickering steadily, the phone ringing louder than ever. Alex's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground. His breaths came in shallow gasps as the ringing echoed in his skull, relentless and deafening. "Why?" he screamed, clutching his head. "What do you want from me?" The phone stopped ringing. Alex looked up, his vision blurred with tears. The booth was silent now, its door slightly ajar. The receiver hung in its usual spot, swaying gently. "Answer," a voice whispered from the shadows. Alex turned, but no one was there. The voice came again, soft and commanding. "Answer it." His body moved on its own, his legs carrying him toward the booth. He didn't want to go, didn't want to hear the voice again, but the pull was too strong. His hand trembled as he reached for the receiver. When he lifted it to his ear, the voice spoke immediately. "You can't run from the past, Alex." The line crackled, and Alex thought he heard something else, a faint gurgling sound, like someone struggling to breathe. "Do you feel it?" The voice continued, low and taunting. "The weight of what you've done? You can't destroy me. You can't destroy the truth." The gurgling grew louder, mingling with faint whispers that overlapped and grew until they became a deafening roar. Alex dropped the receiver, stumbling out of the booth. The last thing he saw before running to his car was the booth, standing silent and pristine, its light flickering steadily in the dark. He didn't look back, but as he drove away, the ringing followed him. It came from his phone, from the radio, from somewhere deep inside his mind. And no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't escape it. This section builds to the climax with Alex's desperate attempts to destroy the booth, only to discover its indestructible nature and the deep connection it has to his past. Let me know if you'd like to move to the resolution or need adjustments. Alex didn't return to the booth for weeks. He avoided the road entirely, taking a longer, more winding route home, even if it added nearly an hour to his drive. But no matter how far he went, the memory of the ringing followed him. It wasn't just a sound in his ears, it was a feeling, a pressure in his chest, a weight that refused to lift. At night, even in the safety of his apartment, he would wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom sound of the ringing echoing in his mind. He told himself it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The booth was just a thing, a relic, a meaningless structure, and the voice was a trick of his tired mind. But the fear never left him. And then, one night, it started again. It was 2:57 a.m. when Alex's car sputtered to a stop on the desolate road. He swore under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the engine gave one final, pitiful cough before falling silent. The dashboard lights blinked out, leaving him in total darkness. He sat there for a long moment, his breath fogging up the windshield. This stretch of road was too familiar. He knew exactly what lay just ahead, shrouded in the shadows. The phone booth. The clock on his dashboard flickered back to life, the numbers glowing faintly in the dark. It was 3 a.m. Alex's heart sank as the ringing began. It was louder than ever, cutting through the silence like a scream. He closed his eyes, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Don't go," he told himself. "Stay in the car. Don't answer it." The ringing didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, as though it knew he was there, sitting just out of reach. "I won't do it," Alex muttered, his voice trembling, but the booth didn't care. Eventually, the ringing stopped. Alex opened his eyes, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. The silence was deafening, almost oppressive, and for a moment, he thought he had won. But then his phone lit up on the passenger seat, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. Unknown caller. The ringing started again. Alex stared at the phone, his hands shaking. He didn't answer. He wouldn't answer. Instead, he reached over and powered it off, the screen going black. But even with the phone silenced, the ringing continued. It came from the dashboard, the vents, the very air around him. It was everywhere, impossible to escape, and Alex screamed, slamming his fists against the steering wheel. "Leave me alone," he shouted. The ringing stopped again, replaced by a faint whisper that seemed to echo from the corners of the car. "You can't ignore it forever, Alex." He froze, his breath catching in his throat. "You know what you've done," the voice continued, low and menacing. "You can pretend it's gone, but it will always be there, waiting." Alex covered his ears, his eyes squeezed shut. No, it's not real. You're not real." The voice chuckled, soft and cold. "Keep telling yourself that." The next morning, Alex's car was found abandoned on the side of the road. He was sitting on the curb a few feet away, his face pale and his eyes hollow. When the tow truck driver asked if he was all right, Alex only nodded, mumbling something about a phone booth. He didn't drive past it again for months. He found other routes, other excuses to avoid the stretch of road, and for a while, it worked. The ringing faded, replaced by an uneasy silence, but the fear never truly left him. Every time he thought about it, his stomach knotted. Every time he saw an old phone booth on TV, in a photograph, even in passing his pulse quickened, and his hands began to shake. But life went on. He got used to the fear, learning to live with it like a shadow that followed him everywhere. He told himself that if he ignored it long enough, it would fade completely. One night, months later, Alex found himself driving down the same road. It wasn't intentional. He had missed a turn, and the detour brought him back to the place he had sworn to avoid. As he neared the familiar bend, his heart raced, and his palms began to sweat. The booth was still there. It looked exactly the same, its glass panes smeared with grime, the light inside flickering weakly. But tonight, it was silent. Alex slowed his car as he passed, his eyes locked on the booth. The air seemed heavier, the shadows darker, but the phone didn't ring. For the first time in months, Alex felt a flicker of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe the nightmare had finally ended. But just as he drove past, the light inside the booth flared briefly, and in his rearview mirror, Alex saw the receiver swinging gently on its cord. The ringing didn't start again, but Alex knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. 2. The day I moved into the old boarding house, I felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. The building was ancient, its exterior weathered by decades of rain and wind, but it had a certain charm that drew me in. The rent was cheap, the location convenient, and the landlady, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper, seemed pleasant enough. She'd handed me the keys with a polite smile, her eyes lingering on me for just a moment too long before she wished me luck and shuffled back into her quarters. My room was small but cozy. The furniture was mismatched but functional. A creaky wooden bed, a scratch desk, and a wardrobe that smelled faintly of mothballs. A single window overlooked the street below, where the glow of a street lamp flickered intermittently. Despite the room's imperfections, it felt like a refuge, a place where I could start fresh. The only thing that gave me pause was the bathroom mirror. It was a large, ornate piece framed in tarnished silver, far too grand for the modest little bathroom it hung in. The glass was slightly warped, the kind that made reflections seem just a little off. At first glance, it appeared normal enough, but the longer I looked at it, the more uneasy I felt. There was something about the way it reflected the room behind me. The angle seemed wrong, the proportions slightly distorted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. Shrugging off the feeling, I unpacked my belongings and settled in. The first few days were uneventful. I went about my routine work during the day, returning to the boarding house in the evening to read or watch TV. The other tenants kept to themselves, and aside from the occasional creak of floorboards or murmur of voices through the walls, the place was quiet. But the mirror, it bothered me. Every time I caught my reflection, I felt a strange sense of disconnection. My movements in the glass seemed ever so slightly out of sync with my own, as if the reflection hesitated for a fraction of a second before mimicking me. I told myself it was just the distortion in the glass playing tricks on my mind, but the unease lingered. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. In the reflection, the bathroom door behind me was slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd closed it when I entered. I turned around quickly, but the door was shut tight. When I looked back at the mirror, the door in the reflection was closed as well. A chill ran down my spine. I stared at the mirror, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Perhaps the stress of moving and adjusting to a new place was taking its toll. Shaking my head, I finished brushing my teeth and went to bed, determined to put it out of my mind. But the incidents didn't stop. Over the next few days, I began to notice more discrepancies. Objects in the reflection didn't always match their real-world counterparts. A towel hanging on the rack appeared to shift positions when I wasn't looking. The light bulb above the sink flickered in the reflection, even though it remained steady in the room. Once, I thought I saw a shadow pass across the mirror that didn't exist in the room itself. I tried to rationalize it. The mirror was old, the glass flawed. It wasn't unusual for antique mirrors to have imperfections, but deep down, I knew this was more than a trick of the light. Late one night, unable to sleep, I found myself standing in front of the mirror again. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your heartbeat sound deafening. I stared at my reflection, daring it to betray me, to show me something I couldn't explain away. And then it did. My reflection blinked. I hadn't. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. My hands gripped the edge of the sink, the porcelain cold beneath my fingertips. I stared at the glass, unblinking, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure in the mirror stood perfectly still, mirroring my stance, but something about it was wrong. Its eyes didn't look quite right, the pupils slightly larger than they should have been, the whites tinged with a faint gray. As I leaned closer, my breath fogging the surface, I realized the face in the mirror wasn't entirely mine. The contours were off, the cheekbones sharper, the jawline more angular. I raised a trembling hand to touch my face, and my reflection mimicked the motion. But there was a hesitation, just a fraction of a second, as though it were deciding whether to follow my lead. Desperate for answers, I reached out and pressed my palm against the glass. A wave of cold shot through me, unlike anything I'd ever felt. It wasn't the chill of a cool surface, it was deeper, sharper, as though the cold were seeping directly into my bones. I jerked my hand back, staring at the faint imprint left behind on the glass. The mirror seemed to ripple, the distortion spreading outward like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. My chest tightened, and the room seemed to grow darker, the edges of my vision blurring. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint, whispering sound, just on the edge of perception. It was too soft to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was pleading. The following night, things took a darker turn. As I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair, I caught movement behind me in the reflection. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, flitted across the room. My breath hitched, and I spun around, my heart pounding. The bathroom was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone. But then I noticed something else. My reflection, it was slow. I raised my hand to touch my cheek, and my reflection followed the motion. But there was a delay, barely a second, but long enough to make my stomach drop. My movements felt sluggish in the glass, as though something on the other side was struggling to keep up. I stepped closer, my face inches from the surface, studying every detail. The reflection's lips parted slightly, just before mine did. I gasped and stumbled back, my head swimming with confusion and fear. This was no trick of the light, no distortion of old glass. Someone was behind the mirror, mimicking me imperfectly, and the realization sent shivers down my spine. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind outside, set my nerves on edge. And all the while, the mirror loomed in the bathroom, waiting for me to look again. The next day, I decided I had to act. My fear had grown unbearable, and I couldn't stand the idea of the mirror existing in my home any longer. Armed with a hammer I'd borrowed from Mrs. Harper, I stood before the mirror, my hands trembling as I raised the tool above my head. The reflection seemed to flicker, the edges of the glass rippling like water. "I have to do this," I whispered to myself, my voice shaking. But just as I brought the hammer down, the glass didn't shatter. Instead, the mirror seemed to resist, the hammer bouncing back as though I'd struck solid stone. A low, resonant hum filled the room, vibrating through the walls and into my bones. I dropped the hammer in shock, my hands tingling from the impact. And then, the reflection moved. Not in sync with me, not as a mimic. It moved on its own. Slowly, the figure raised its hand, placing its palm against the glass from the other side. Its gray-tinged eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, as its lips curled into a faint, eerie smile. My own face twisted in terror, but the reflection's expression remained calm, almost serene. The room grew colder, the air thick with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I stumbled back, but the figure pressed closer to the glass, as though it were trying to push through. My mind raced, panic overtaking me as I searched for anything to stop it. The faint whispering returned, louder now, more distinct, though still unintelligible. It sounded almost like laughter. The reflection leaned closer, its hand sliding down the glass as if to beckon me forward. I felt an overwhelming compulsion to step closer, to press my hand against the glass again. My body moved without my consent, my fingers inches from the cold surface. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the figure spoke. "Let me in." The words sent a bolt of terror through me, snapping me out of the trance. I staggered back, grabbing the hammer again. My hand shook as I raised it, determination flaring through my fear. "You won't," I hissed, and swung the hammer with all my strength. This time, the glass cracked. A jagged line split the surface, and the figure recoiled, its serene expression twisting into a snarl. The whispering turned to a low growl, reverberating through the room as the crack spread further. I swung again, desperate to break the mirror completely, to end whatever nightmare I had unleashed. The reflection began to fade, its features distorting as the cracks splintered across the glass. With one final swing, the mirror shattered, shards raining down onto the floor. The growling ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I collapsed to my knees, my chest heaving as I stared at the broken pieces scattered around me. In each shard, the reflection was gone. All I saw was my own pale, trembling face staring back. The next morning, I packed my belongings and left the boarding house. The landlady didn't ask why, and I didn't offer an explanation. The weight that had settled over the house seemed to cling to my skin even as I stepped into the fresh air outside, but I told myself it was over. The mirror was gone, shattered into countless pieces. Whatever it was, it couldn't follow me. Or so I hoped. Weeks passed, and I tried to forget. I moved into a new apartment, smaller but brighter, with no tarnished mirrors or creaky floorboards. I filled my days with work and my nights with distraction, burying myself in books and TV to keep the memories at bay. But the dreams wouldn't stop. In my sleep, I saw the mirror, whole and pristine, its ornate silver frame gleaming in the dim light. I saw my reflection, staring back at me, its lips curling into that same eerie smile. Sometimes, it moved before I did, its gray-tinged eyes watching me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. And always, in the background, I heard the faint whispering, growing louder until I woke gasping for air. I avoided mirrors as much as I could, but they were everywhere in elevators, in store windows, in the gleaming surface of my phone screen. Every time I caught my reflection, I braced myself, half expecting it to linger, to move on its own. It never did, but the fear remained, coiled tightly in my chest. I told myself it was just my imagination, the lingering effects of a traumatic experience. But late at night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, somehow, the mirror was waiting for me to look again. 2. The day I moved into the old boarding house, I felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. The building was ancient, its exterior weathered by decades of rain and wind, but it had a certain charm that drew me in. The rent was cheap, the location convenient, and the landlady, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper, seemed pleasant enough. She'd handed me the keys with a polite smile, her eyes lingering on me for just a moment too long before she wished me luck and shuffled back into her quarters. My room was small but cozy. The furniture was mismatched but functional. A creaky wooden bed, a scratch desk, and a wardrobe that smelled faintly of mothballs. A single window overlooked the street below, where the glow of a street lamp flickered intermittently. Despite the room's imperfections, it felt like a refuge, a place where I could start fresh. The only thing that gave me pause was the bathroom mirror. It was a large, ornate piece framed in tarnished silver, far too grand for the modest little bathroom it hung in. The glass was slightly warped, the kind that made reflections seem just a little off. At first glance, it appeared normal enough, but the longer I looked at it, the more uneasy I felt. There was something about the way it reflected the room behind me. The angle seemed wrong, the proportions slightly distorted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. Shrugging off the feeling, I unpacked my belongings and settled in. The first few days were uneventful. I went about my routine work during the day, returning to the boarding house in the evening to read or watch TV. The other tenants kept to themselves, and aside from the occasional creak of floorboards or murmur of voices through the walls, the place was quiet. But the mirror, it bothered me. Every time I caught my reflection, I felt a strange sense of disconnection. My movements in the glass seemed ever so slightly out of sync with my own, as if the reflection hesitated for a fraction of a second before mimicking me. I told myself it was just the distortion in the glass playing tricks on my mind, but the unease lingered. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. In the reflection, the bathroom door behind me was slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd closed it when I entered. I turned around quickly, but the door was shut tight. When I looked back at the mirror, the door in the reflection was closed as well. A chill ran down my spine. I stared at the mirror, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Perhaps the stress of moving and adjusting to a new place was taking its toll. Shaking my head, I finished brushing my teeth and went to bed, determined to put it out of my mind. But the incidents didn't stop. Over the next few days, I began to notice more discrepancies. Objects in the reflection didn't always match their real-world counterparts. A towel hanging on the rack appeared to shift positions when I wasn't looking. The light bulb above the sink flickered in the reflection, even though it remained steady in the room. Once, I thought I saw a shadow pass across the mirror that didn't exist in the room itself. I tried to rationalize it. The mirror was old, the glass flawed. It wasn't unusual for antique mirrors to have imperfections, but deep down, I knew this was more than a trick of the light. Late one night, unable to sleep, I found myself standing in front of the mirror again. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your heartbeat sound deafening. I stared at my reflection, daring it to betray me, to show me something I couldn't explain away. And then it did. My reflection blinked. I hadn't. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. My hands gripped the edge of the sink, the porcelain cold beneath my fingertips. I stared at the glass, unblinking, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure in the mirror stood perfectly still, mirroring my stance, but something about it was wrong. Its eyes didn't look quite right, the pupils slightly larger than they should have been, the whites tinged with a faint gray. As I leaned closer, my breath fogging the surface, I realized the face in the mirror wasn't entirely mine. The contours were off, the cheekbones sharper, the jawline more angular. I raised a trembling hand to touch my face, and my reflection mimicked the motion. But there was a hesitation, just a fraction of a second, as though it were deciding whether to follow my lead. Desperate for answers, I reached out and pressed my palm against the glass. A wave of cold shot through me, unlike anything I'd ever felt. It wasn't the chill of a cool surface, it was deeper, sharper, as though the cold were seeping directly into my bones. I jerked my hand back, staring at the faint imprint left behind on the glass. The mirror seemed to ripple, the distortion spreading outward like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. My chest tightened, and the room seemed to grow darker, the edges of my vision blurring. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint, whispering sound, just on the edge of perception. It was too soft to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was pleading. The following night, things took a darker turn. As I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair, I caught movement behind me in the reflection. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, flitted across the room. My breath hitched, and I spun around, my heart pounding. The bathroom was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone. But then I noticed something else. My reflection, it was slow. I raised my hand to touch my cheek, and my reflection followed the motion. But there was a delay, barely a second, but long enough to make my stomach drop. My movements felt sluggish in the glass, as though something on the other side was struggling to keep up. I stepped closer, my face inches from the surface, studying every detail. The reflection's lips parted slightly, just before mine did. I gasped and stumbled back, my head swimming with confusion and fear. This was no trick of the light, no distortion of old glass. Someone was behind the mirror, mimicking me imperfectly, and the realization sent shivers down my spine. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind outside, set my nerves on edge. And all the while, the mirror loomed in the bathroom, waiting for me to look again. The next day, I decided I had to act. My fear had grown unbearable, and I couldn't stand the idea of the mirror existing in my home any longer. Armed with a hammer I'd borrowed from Mrs. Harper, I stood before the mirror, my hands trembling as I raised the tool above my head. The reflection seemed to flicker, the edges of the glass rippling like water. I have to do this, I whispered to myself, my voice shaking. But just as I brought the hammer down, the glass didn't shatter. Instead, the mirror seemed to resist, the hammer bouncing back as though I'd struck solid stone. A low, resonant hum filled the room, vibrating through the walls and into my bones. I dropped the hammer in shock, my hands tingling from the impact. And then, the reflection moved. Not in sync with me, not as a mimic. It moved on its own. Slowly, the figure raised its hand, placing its palm against the glass from the other side. Its gray-tinged eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, as its lips curled into a faint, eerie smile. My own face twisted in terror, but the reflection's expression remained calm, almost serene. The room grew colder, the air thick with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I stumbled back, but the figure pressed closer to the glass, as though it were trying to push through. My mind raced, panic overtaking me as I searched for anything to stop it. The faint whispering returned, louder now, more distinct, though still unintelligible. It sounded almost like laughter. The reflection leaned closer, its hand sliding down the glass as if to beckon me forward. I felt an overwhelming compulsion to step closer, to press my hand against the glass again. My body moved without my consent, my fingers inches from the cold surface. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the figure spoke. "Let me in." The words sent a bolt of terror through me, snapping me out of the trance. I staggered back, grabbing the hammer again. My hand shook as I raised it, determination flaring through my fear. "You won't," I hissed, and swung the hammer with all my strength. This time, the glass cracked. A jagged line split the surface, and the figure recoiled, its serene expression twisting into a snarl. The whispering turned to a low growl, reverberating through the room as the cracks spread further. I swung again, desperate to break the mirror completely, to end whatever nightmare I had unleashed. The reflection began to fade, its features distorting as the cracks splintered across the glass. With one final swing, the mirror shattered, shards raining down onto the floor. The growling ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I collapsed to my knees, my chest heaving as I stared at the broken pieces scattered around me. In each shard, the reflection was gone. All I saw was my own pale, trembling face staring back. The next morning, I packed my belongings and left the boarding house. The landlady didn't ask why, and I didn't offer an explanation. The weight that had settled over the house seemed to cling to my skin even as I stepped into the fresh air outside, but I told myself it was over. The mirror was gone, shattered into countless pieces. Whatever it was, it couldn't follow me. Or so I hoped. Weeks passed, and I tried to forget. I moved into a new apartment, smaller but brighter, with no tarnished mirrors or creaky floorboards. I filled my days with work and my nights with distraction, burying myself in books and TV to keep the memories at bay. But the dreams wouldn't stop. In my sleep, I saw the mirror, whole and pristine, its ornate silver frame gleaming in the dim light. I saw my reflection, staring back at me, its lips curling into that same eerie smile. Sometimes, it moved before I did, its gray-tinged eyes watching me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. And always, in the background, I heard the faint whispering, growing louder until I woke gasping for air. I avoided mirrors as much as I could, but they were everywhere in elevators, in store windows, in the gleaming surface of my phone screen. Every time I caught my reflection, I braced myself, half expecting it to linger, to move on its own. It never did, but the fear remained, coiled tightly in my chest. I told myself it was just my imagination, the lingering effects of a traumatic experience. But late at night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, somehow, the mirror was waiting for me to look again. It had been an excruciatingly long day at the office. My shoulders ached, my head throbbed, and all I wanted was to sink into the comfort of my couch with a glass of wine. The late autumn wind howled outside as I pulled into my driveway, the soft glow of my living room light spilling through the curtains. I remember feeling relieved my sanctuary awaited me. Stepping inside, I was greeted by the familiar creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my boots. The air in the house was colder than I expected, a sharp contrast to the coziness I usually associated with this space. I kicked off my shoes, placed my bag on the counter, and reached for the thermostat. As I turned the dial to crank up the heat, I noticed something, a strange stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The first thing I spotted when I turned toward the living room was the silhouette. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable against the dim light of the room. The old leather armchair near the lopsided coffee table was a family heirloom, worn and cracked with age. But now, it was occupied. My breath hitched. Someone was sitting there. The shape was dark and motionless, perfectly framed by the orange flicker of the fireplace behind it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, tired as I was. The figure seemed too still, too perfectly aligned with the contours of the chair to be real. I took a step closer, my fingers brushing the light switch, but something stopped me, a sinking weight in my chest, a primal instinct screaming at me to leave it alone. I stood frozen, torn between fear and reason. My brain scrambled for answers. Did I leave the door unlocked? Could someone have broken in? Yet, the figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. The silence was oppressive, pressing against my ears like cotton. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed muted. Hello? My voice cracked, barely audible. The figure remained still. My heart pounded against my ribs. I took another cautious step forward, the floor creaking under my weight. The flickering firelight danced across the room, casting shadows that made the figure's outline seem to shift ever so slightly. And then it hit me, the smell. A faint, metallic tang hung in the air, mixing with the scent of aged leather and the dying embers of the fire. It was subtle but unmistakable, and it churned my stomach. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, that the long day had finally taken its toll, but something deeper told me otherwise. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, fingers trembling as I unlocked it. The glow of the screen was almost blinding in the dim room. With a shaky thumb, I tapped the flashlight icon. The sudden beam of light cut through the shadows, illuminating the chair. There was nothing there. The chair was empty, the leather worn and cracked as always. No sign of the figure, no indentation in the seat cushions. My pulse thundered in my ears as I swept the flashlight across the room. Everything was in its place. The rug slightly askew, the stack of books on the coffee table, the half-empty mug of tea I'd forgotten to wash that morning. I tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. But as I turned to head to the kitchen, the beam of light caught something on the arm of the chair, a dark smudge, faint but undeniable. I stepped closer, my breath hitching again. It wasn't a smudge. It was a handprint, pressed into the leather as if someone had been gripping it tightly. My blood turned to ice. The handprint was wet, glistening under the flashlight. Slowly, almost unwillingly, I raised the light to inspect my own hands. They were clean. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, and for the first time, I noticed the faint sound of breathing. It wasn't mine. It was slow, shallow, coming from somewhere just behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but the room was empty. The air felt thicker now, oppressive, as if the walls were closing in. I could feel that something was watching me. My sanctuary no longer felt safe. And then, just as I began to back away toward the door, the fireplace crackled loudly, sending a shower of sparks into the room. The shadows shifted once more, and for a brief moment, I saw it again. The figure was there, seated in the chair, staring at me with hollow, unblinking eyes. I bolted for the door, my legs moving before my brain could process what was happening. The cold night air hit me like a wall as I stumbled onto the porch. My hands fumbled with my car keys as I glanced back toward the house. The living room window was dark now, the glow of the fireplace extinguished. But the silhouette was still there, faint but unmistakable, watching me from behind the glass. I stood outside for several minutes, catching my breath and willing myself to calm down. My logical mind told me to go back in, to confront whatever this was, a trick of the light, perhaps, or my overworked imagination. Clutching my phone tightly, I resolved to prove to myself that there was nothing to fear. I stepped back inside, flicking the light switch as I entered the living room. The bulbs hummed softly, flooding the space with warm, artificial light. The armchair was empty again, just as it had been when I last checked. Yet, the oppressive weight in the air hadn't lifted. It pressed down on me like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe. I approached the chair cautiously, my footsteps hesitant. The handprint was gone now, the leather smooth and unblemished. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they grazed the armrest. It was cold, almost unnaturally so, as if it had been left outside in the biting wind. Suddenly, the light flickered. My heart jumped as the room plunged into semi-darkness before the bulbs stabilized. I turned quickly, scanning the room for any sign of movement. Nothing, but the silence was deafening, broken only by the faint buzz of the lights above me. I decided to test it. I turned off the lights entirely, plunging the room into shadow. For a moment, nothing happened. My eyes adjusted slowly, the faint glow of the fireplace embers providing just enough illumination to make out the shapes of furniture. Then there it was, the silhouette, sitting in the chair as if it had never left. My breath caught in my throat, my chest tightening with fear. It didn't move, didn't react to my presence. It just sat there, an unnerving stillness radiating from its form. I turned the lights back on in a panic, the switch clicking loudly in the quiet room. The chair was empty again, the silhouette gone. My pulse raced as I stared at the spot where it had been. Was I losing my mind? The metallic tang returned, stronger this time, filling my nostrils and making my stomach churn. The weight in the air grew heavier, pressing down on me until I felt like I was suffocating. I staggered backward, clutching at my chest, desperate for relief from the invisible pressure. And then, as I turned to leave the room, I heard it, a soft, raspy whisper coming from the direction of the chair. "Stay." Each night after that, it happened again. The silhouette returned, always seated in the chair when the lights were off. At first, it stayed in the same rigid posture, staring straight ahead, unmoving. But then, it began to change. One night, its head tilted slightly to the side, as though it were curious. The next night, its arms rested differently. One hand draped over the chair's armrest as though it were settling in more comfortably. I tried to record it, setting up my phone to film the chair overnight. But every time I reviewed the footage, the chair appeared empty, as though nothing had been there. I thought perhaps the darkness was playing tricks on the camera, but the growing unease in my chest told me otherwise. One evening, after yet another failed attempt to capture proof, I sat down with my laptop, searching for explanations. Shadow figures, sleep deprivation, paranormal activity. Every theory felt inadequate. The descriptions I found didn't quite match the chilling, oppressive feeling that filled the room whenever the silhouette appeared. The nights grew worse. I would wake up to find the chair turned slightly, as if it had been moved. Sometimes I swore I heard faint creaks, like the leather stretching under weight, though I was too terrified to look. On one occasion, I entered the living room to find the chair facing entirely toward the window, as though whoever or whatever sat there had been watching the street. The presence felt stronger, more invasive. I no longer felt alone, even in the brightest parts of the day. The metallic tang in the air became a constant companion, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Stay," it said, always the same word, delivered in that same rasping, breathy voice. It echoed in my mind long after the sound had faded. I was losing sleep, my nerves fraying more with each passing night. Desperation clawed at me, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. It was as though the house, the chair, the figure, everything had rooted me in place. I was trapped, and it knew it. One sleepless night, desperate for answers, I began combing through the storage boxes in the attic. The house was old, passed down through generations of my family, and the attic was a cluttered archive of forgotten belongings. Dust motes floated in the pale light of my flashlight as I dug through boxes of yellowed newspapers, brittle letters, and tarnished trinkets. And then I found a photograph. It was tucked into a faded leather-bound album, its edges curled and its surface smudged with age. The image showed a man sitting in the leather armchair, the very same one in my living room. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his hair neatly combed, and his expression was grave. There was something unsettling about his eyes, dark, piercing, and strangely familiar. I flipped through the album, finding more photos of the same man. In every picture, he was seated in the chair, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed directly at the camera. My chest tightened as I realized that in some of the photos, his position mirrored the subtle changes I had noticed in the silhouette, the tilt of his head, the placement of his hands. It was as though the figure had been reenacting these poses night after night. I turned the photograph over. Scrawled in faded ink on the back were the words, "Edwin Morrissey, 1898. A chill ran down my spine. I had never heard the name before, yet it felt disturbingly significant, as though I should have known it. The air in the attic grew colder, and the metallic tang returned, stronger than ever. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Panic surged through me as I clutched the photograph tightly, stumbling back down the stairs. The oppressive weight followed me, pressing down on my shoulders like unseen hands. Back in the living room, I placed the photograph on the coffee table, staring at it as though it might offer some explanation. The chair loomed behind it, silent and menacing. The whispers began again, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. "Stay," they hissed. "You must stay." I felt a strange pull toward the chair, as though an invisible thread were drawing me in. My legs felt heavy, my movements sluggish. I shook my head, fighting the compulsion, but deep down, I knew the truth. Edwin Morrissey wasn't just a memory. He was here, and he wasn't going to let me go. That night, I decided I couldn't keep running. As the clock struck midnight and the oppressive air thickened once more, I sat down in front of the chair. My heart pounded as I spoke aloud. "Edwin," I said, my voice shaking, What do you want? Why are you here? The shadows in the room seemed to shift, the flickering light of the fireplace casting unnatural shapes on the walls. The silhouette appeared, seated in the chair, its form more distinct than ever. For the first time, it moved. Its head turned slowly toward me, the hollow void where eyes should have been seeming to bore into my soul. "Stay," it rasped, the single word filling the room like a physical force. But this time, there was something else, a pleading undertone, almost mournful. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Why?" I asked again. "Why do you need me to stay?" The air grew colder, the metallic tang sharper. The figure raised an arm, pointing toward the photograph on the coffee table. Trembling, I reached for it. As my fingers touched the worn edges, a sudden wave of emotion washed over me, grief, longing, and an overwhelming sense of loneliness. "You're trapped here," I whispered, the realization dawning on me. "Aren't you?" The figure didn't respond, but its form began to waver, growing fainter. The pressure in the room lessened, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. I clutched the photograph tighter. "I'll help you," I said, unsure of what I could do but determined nonetheless. "I'll find a way to free you." For the first time since the haunting began, the figure seemed to relax. Its rigid posture softened, and the shadows around it began to dissipate. The room felt lighter, the air easier to breathe. As the figure faded completely, a final whisper echoed through the room, so faint I almost didn't hear it. "Thank you." And then it was gone. The days that followed felt eerily calm. The metallic tang that had permeated the air was gone, replaced by the faint, comforting smell of aged wood and leather. The chair sat in its usual place, bathed in sunlight streaming through the windows during the day and cast in the warm glow of the fireplace at night. It looked almost inviting again, its once ominous presence now reduced to the quiet dignity of an old family heirloom. But I couldn't bring myself to sit in it. Not yet. I kept the photograph on the coffee table, a silent reminder of the nights I spent haunted by Edwin Morrissey's shadow. I would often find myself staring at it, tracing the lines of his face with my eyes, wondering about the life he had lived and why he had been tied to this place for so long. The connection between us lingered, though the oppressive weight that had once filled the house was now just a memory. Every so often, I thought I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow shifting where it shouldn't be, the faint creak of the chair as though someone had just leaned back in it. But the air was lighter now, and the whispers were gone. I chose to keep the chair. Despite everything, it felt wrong to part with it. It was a piece of my family's history, and now, in some strange way, a part of mine as well. I couldn't deny the unease that still prickled the back of my neck when I walked past it at night. But I also couldn't shake the sense of peace that had settled over the house. Edwin was gone, but his memory lingered, woven into the fabric of the chair and the walls of the house. I often wondered if he had found the freedom he sought, or if some part of him remained, watching over the place he had called home for so long. And so, life went on. The chair remained, a quiet sentinel in the corner of the room. And though the nights were no longer filled with whispers and shadows, I knew I would never forget the figure that once sat there, watching, waiting, and finally finding release.